We've had a very stimulating afternoon session opening the symposium, and I'm pleased to welcome students, faculty, and guests back into the room, or rooms, I should say, and to the keynote lecture in the symposium, Is Drawing Dead, convened by George Knight and Victor Agran, critics in our school, whom I wish to thank, and I think we all will join me, I hope you will all join me in thanking them for the tremendous work of scholarship that is represented by this symposium. I also wish to thank Massimo Scolari, who opened the proceedings last night with his lecture representations coinciding with the inauguration of his exhibition in our gallery, Massimo Scolari, The Representation of Architecture, which Professor Scolari curated with the assistance of Brian Butterfield and designed with the assistance of Brian Butterfield, Director of Exhibitions, and Laura Silvestrini, and which is interpreted in an excellent catalog essay by Dan Shearer, lecturer in history and theory in our school. Tonight, before this evening's keynote, I would also like to express my appreciation to the very many who helped make the organization of this weekend's event possible and going as smoothly as it is, at least till now. Especially our school's Associate Dean, John Jacobson, and our school's events coordinators, Richard DeFlumery and Barbie Lynn Harnoy. And on behalf of the students and faculty, I want to welcome the many symposium participants who honor us with their presence and their scholarship. Is Drawing Dead is the second J. Irwin Miller Symposium. The J. Irwin Miller Fund, the first fund at our school to dedicate resources expressly in support of symposia, was established in 2010 through the extraordinary generosity of Mr. Miller's children, Catherine, Margaret, Elizabeth, and Will. I am deeply grateful to the Miller family for choosing to honor the memory of their father through this partnership with the School of Architecture. J. Irwin Miller was a 1931 Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Yale College. As an undergraduate, his major subject was Greek and Latin. How many Greek and Latin students do we have now? After Yale, he continued his education at Oxford University, where he studied philosophy, politics, and economics at Balliol College. In 1934, Mr. Miller began his professional career with the family business Cummins Engine Company, ultimately serving as president from 1947 to 51, and chairman thereafter until 1977. During World War II, Mr. Miller saw active duty as a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy in the South Pacific. I had the privilege of getting to know Irwin Miller and his wife Xenia near the ends of their lives. They were among the most remarkable people I've ever encountered. Mr. Miller was one in a million, a successful businessman, a pillar of his church, a loyal alumnus of Yale who served as a corporation fellow from 1959 to 1977, and a fierce advocate of freedom of choice for an opportunity for all. Irwin Miller was an outstanding citizen second to none, the embodiment of ethical behavior, a model for each of us. Tonight, Sir Peter Cook will deliver the keynote lecture, which will be followed with a response from Stanislaus von Moos, Vincent Scully, visiting professor in architectural history in our school. Peter Cook, founder of Archigram and former director of the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London and the Bartlett School of Architecture at University College London, has been a pivotal figure within the global architectural world for over half a century. Peter Cook's accomplishments as part of the radical experimental group Archigram have been the subject of numerous publications and exhibitions. In the 1960s, Archigram transformed the boundaries of architectural possibilities for a rebellious generation. Peter Cook has, from the very beginning of his career, made waves as a theorist, operating at the margins of the architecture profession. However, with the construction of his arts building, the Kunsthaus Graz, aka the friendly alien, in Graz, Austria, which he designed in partnership with Colin Fournier. His work can now be encountered by a wider public, a process that's set to continue with the construction of the Vienna Business and Economic University's new law facility. The history of 20th century architecture cannot be complete without the consideration of archigram, but Sir Peter's work as director of the ArtNet in London, curator of the British Pavilion at the Venice Architectural Biennale, as well as numerous exhibitions that he has organized around the world, and his work as a building architect are also, and indeed are, of immense importance. Starting out in the 1960s as the enfant terrible of the anti-establishment, in 2004, he was awarded the gold medal of the Royal Institute of British Architects. How times change. And in 2007, he was knighted by the Queen for his services to architecture and teaching. So even if you're an enfant terrible, you can become a sir. Peter Cook's 2008 book, Drawing, published by Wiley, is the spiritual backbone of this symposium. For architects today, it is the definitive contemporary discussion of the topic, beautifully written from the head and the heart. Drawing, copies of Drawing, will be available for sale in our school's gallery following this evening's program, and Sir Peter will be available to sign them. Now, it's my great pleasure to welcome Sir Peter Cook to Yale as he delivers the lecture, Real is Only Halfway There. Peter Cook.
Thank you. Could I have the lights down? Oh, and the first slide up, I guess. Shock was the situation that faced me one day in the Architectural Association where I taught alongside this guy, who some of you probably know, Dalibor Vesely, a Czech intellectual who hangs out in London and sometimes, I believe, at Penn. We were just spending a typical afternoon. We'd been on a jury, and Dalibor said, buildings don't matter. Drawings matter much, much more than buildings. And that was my shock. I was horrified. Now, you have to put it into a personal perspective, because that was at the moment when I hadn't hardly built anything. I was also known as a drawing person. And yet, this comment of Dalibor's totally shocked me and still shocks me. And yet, because in choosing the title, Real is Only Halfway There, I'm really alluding to something quite difficult. What I'm trying to talk about is, for me, quite difficult because it's a sort of intangible. I hope that I won't entirely talk about drawing as drawing. I'm a fraud, anyhow. I was a very poor drawer as I left grammar school and went to my first architecture school in provincial Bournemouth. Even in that rather poor place, there were people who could draw better than me. And of course, subsequently in sort of looking after the Bartlett, there have been always many, many people down the corridor who can draw better than me. Some people very close to me, Ron Heron, the late Ron Heron, David Green, Christine Hawley, C.J. Lim, to name but four people who can outdraw me at the drop of a hat. And of course, the wonderful Mike Webb, who I shall talk about a bit later. But I struggled with it because it seemed to me immensely important to be able to communicate ideas, to try and discover ideas. And what other way than drawing? Yes, I could make cathedrals out of balsa wood, but that wasn't enough. And I think there's something of the sort of Puritan ethic, dare I say it, in suggesting, therefore, that because drawing has been a struggle, that I'm a little bit dismissive of all these methods that are now available to anybody that don't involve struggle. But that, you'd need to be a psychologist to get under that one. Maybe. One of the things that intrigues me is the question of drawing in relation to itself, in relation to what it means. And there are, I don't like alliterations, but there are 3 C words that seem to come up. One is the word culture, which I think in the lectures that I listened to today so far has been sitting there all the time. And I like to think of one's position as sometimes a maker of drawing as being pulled by the culture around you, or the culture that you've set up around you even sometimes. And the drawing can sometimes push that culture. It's actually involved in a dynamic condition. And that's what I really still very much feel, that drawing is a dynamic issue. Then there's a more tricky issue of craft. Isn't it interesting that in the heyday of all those small architecture galleries that used to exist in Europe and elsewhere, and even now, the beauty of the drawn object, the deftness of the pencil, the coloration, even how it's framed, how it's hung, how it's lit sometimes, is a dodgy territory, because in a sense, I think I use the word here elite, but perhaps what I'm really talking about is the academic end of the architecture world. I think many people in the academic end of the architecture world dismiss anything that's of the hand, of the craft. It was interesting listening to Johanni this afternoon make so much point about this question of the hand as an integral part of the process. But the dismissal of craft, that a craftsman, that there's so many universities want their architecture faculties to become something that is more of an academic discipline, and that the talented craftsman is some kind of secondary being. On the other hand, the public that looks at those drawings, and even the parts of the architectural public that looks at those drawings, are fascinated by the craft. How, I can remember this is the most elite group of audience I've ever had, but the second most elite, which was many years ago at Cornell, where Peter Smith and Colin Rowe and Felix Candela were sitting in the front row, and Ron and I were doing a joint lecture, and we said, shit, we'd better hang in together. And then we braced ourselves for the question at the end of the lecture, and the only question was, what color pencils do you use? So you see, even in that elite situation, in that wonderful place, that preoccupies people. So I think the position of the drawing, that the drawing itself is sitting somewhere between this extremely odd position of its dismissal on the one hand and the fascination with the actual tactility of it, as it were. And then the issue of creativity. My feeling is that many of you sitting here, and I say this as a collective comment to the East Coast of the United States in architectural circles, that many of you are suspicious of creativity. You don't. It's kind of a bit too folksy, sort of a bit too much to do with the person and creativity. What's that spooky stuff? And yet, my purpose this evening, I will be circling around it, probably not very successfully, who knows, around the idea of identifying the creative moment. One of the other things that Dalibor, another conversation with Dalibor, perhaps a softer conversation that used to crop up, was that he would describe himself as a member of the valley culture of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And it was a useful excuse for many things. And I then, alongside him, developed the notion that I was the child of the North Sea culture. This culture of flatlands and winds and strange marshes. And I deliberately, therefore, want to take 2 slides from each of those cultures just to make the point, to come in on this issue of the culture background of architectural drawings, which is Plečnik. Plečnik, after all, was a provincial. He was from Ljubljana. He wasn't really cosmopolitan. And I think the near provincial takes the culture even more seriously. You look at that drawing and you see how it's in love with a certain hint of heroism, and yet there's also a hint of the sinister about it. And Pichler was, Diana used Pichler this afternoon. We had to do a bit of slide swapping so as not to use exactly the same slides. But here's Pichler in another mood, in his imitation of the Vienna actionists, perhaps, his friends. And he's, of course, Tyrolean, not Viennese. One has to remember that. And he's a little bit close to your neck of the woods for comfort. And the blood drips, just like those Peter Kubelka lessons on cooking, where the blood passes through the water and the bone is worked into the ground, and it's to do with death. As somebody who's has a building in Vienna and has built a building in Graz, I have certain feelings about the Austrians, and they are extremely sinister. In contradistinction to that, of course, I'm taking the last time I was in this building was to see the part of the Stirling exhibition, and I've chosen a piece of North Sea culture from Stirling and Gowan, who after all also are provincials, virtually Scottish, one really Scottish and one from Scottish blood. And it's a very ordinary, I deliberately chose a rather ordinary drawing, nothing very glamorous about it. You probably wouldn't put it in a frame unless you had to. But the building has always been one of my favorites, Selwyn College project, which is one of those curling British projects of a certain period, and one of the most original. And if you look carefully at it, it has all the sort of pragmatism of the North Sea culture. It has nooky little windows. It's drawn in a very ordinary way that makes no bones about what is the floor and what is the window. And the handrail is very important. The handrail, this chunky old piece of mahogany probably, is extremely important. And the nooky little window that creeps a bit of second-rate sunshine into the back of the building. And then the curving of the concrete. It's very, very important, the memory of the ship, perhaps. And in fact, if you start looking at it, it's a rather interesting building. It leans and it curves and it has naughty little bits. But it's calm. And I think that says something about the North Sea culture, which has always had to deal with rather tiresome things such as wind and weather and fog and so on. Or there's the other aspect of the English culture, famous William Heath Robinson. Always beware of the English when they're being silly. That is the moment at which they are most serious. And in fact, I think there's a whole book to be written about the connection between Heath Robinson and the British high-tech movement. If you stop to think about it, in those early days in the 60s when I used to walk past guys with their feet sticking out of underneath a car which would never go, but they would spend the whole weekend mending it, and then go and work for Richard Rogers in the daytime, and then celebrate the fact that like in Foster's office, that they had used the longest neoprene gasket in the world, which is rather like the old English musical jest of the biggest aspidestra in the world. No, for them it was the longest neoprene gasket. And that sort of silliness, which only elsewhere you find in Japan, but I digress. Seriously, I could give a whole afternoon on that question. But the silliness is close in on that inventive aspect of the North Sea culture, because after all, our ancestors had to invent in order to feed us. So the question is, what within the tradition of drawing is culture's pull or drawing's role to push? Pichler again, and Diana covered this part of Pichler terribly well, is his searching for another way away from into the ground, perhaps. And it's quite interesting that Pichler told me once that once he'd been to South America and seen all the Inca cities, he totally lost interest in it, which I think is rather interesting. I'm afraid there'll be a few anecdotes from time to time thrown in, because in a sense I'm not a real academic. I'm not a theorist. I sniff around and I'm interested in people. I'm interested in what people do and they think, that's funny. He had that reaction. Then you look next at another drawing and think, I wonder what he's up to now. If he has that sense of humor, or that sense of disdain, or whatever it might be, then these are clues. But this perhaps comes from teaching. Look at Pichler's drawing where there is lovemaking, captured goldfish, scrumpled paper. And one of Pichler's tricks at a certain time was to take Schollerhammer papier and scrunch it, and twist it, and then pass the ink across it so that it was already damaged. Very, very Tyrolean thing to do, I think. Then latterly, Pichler did the unthinkable. He sold enough drawings to build the building that the drawings were of. I think that's I always mention that to students. I say, well, there's this guy in Austria about my age who sold drawings to build the buildings that the drawings were of. What a wonderful loop. And of course, I think it's intriguing that Pichler has always had this close-in relationship with architects. Is he an architect? Is he not? No, not technically. But many, many of my friends, Peter Wilson, Mike Webb, Lebbeus, we all talk about Pichler. We've all talked about Pichler at great length. We've always been bewitched by Pichler, even if we were not of the Valley culture. And so he builds the building in his farmhouse. Somebody who is close into Pichler is going to Domenic. Domenic is for now incapable of communication hardly, but for most of his lifetime has been a close friend of Pichler, trying to be as dramatic as Pichler, actually having been born under the shadow of the rocks near Klagenfurt, but still being a bit of a technician at the same time. And that's intriguing. His drawings want to have the same angst as Pichler, but he's not from the Tyrol, and he is a maker of bits and pieces and knows about wires. And so he's caught in a curious slipstream. Whereas Raymond Abraham, who is also was also Tyrolean, could get closer. And I think, again, Diana talked about him this afternoon, so I don't want to repeat what she said. What intrigues me about this, which is my favorite Abraham project, as a matter of fact, because it was, in a sense, usefully preposterous. I'm fascinated by projects which get to a point where you have to think your way out of it. It's like tying somebody up in a paper bag, and then you say, could he fight his way out of the paper bag? Pichler sets up this extraordinary house, which has mixed overtones. Part of it is in the digging into the ground Pichler tradition. Part of it is the sinister going up into the nowhere. On the other hand, the bubbles drawn at that time could have only been plastic. And the notion of the plastic bubble attached to this sort of creepy Austrian cave-like thing is a wonder. And again, it comes up as we saw this afternoon, in Pichler's nose object, this sort of futurist object put into the Austrian tradition of the sinister. Peter Wilson, I think this is the most it's not a very good slide, but it's a marvelous lost, as far as we know, lost drawing, part of that mysterious story of whatever happened to the Metromedia collection. And it is the Fountain House. Peter Wilson was a very important influence in the AA in the 70s and 80s. And this is probably his most influential drawing. And when one remembers the original drawing, it captured this almost impossible to capture condition of steam and water. Now that raises another issue of, I suppose, under the heading of craft, but also under the heading of trying to touch the untouchable. That sometimes in a drawing you're trying to get to something which you know you can never quite get, but you must try. And if you're a beautiful technician such as Peter, you can get much closer. On the other hand, there is the extraordinary attack of the graphic and the powerful and almost bordering on the political, by which I don't mean political in the normal sense, but political in its position in the trajectory of architecture. Now, one hears or one reads or one's been told that Chernikov was treated as a sort of just a graphic guy by the real, the Veshlins and so on, that he was not a Bill, he was somebody who did these marvelous graphics. But what I can report autobiographically is that when I was a fifth-year student at the AA, I and 3 or 4 other people heard about this book. We heard about the book of 101 Fantasies, and it was up in a cupboard, and the librarian would sit behind you with the key, watching that you didn't nick the book. I was told the other day it's still up there. Alvin didn't have to sell it. It still lives. And it was the most extraordinary thing. I guess the term we would use now is full on. It was absolutely full on. It was 101 things, and they were amazing. And when, years later, I went to Berlin and saw Ludwig Lehr's Umlauf tank, I knew it could be done. Chernikov existed. He exists in the Umlauf tank. But I digress. Not really, because I shall come back to Chernikov. Waxman, I suppose, was somebody that many of us enjoyed to quote, particularly this drawing. And Ron and I were lucky enough to meet him a couple of times and listen to and watch him demonstrate his universal joint. And somehow this drawing is an extension of that universality. What would Waxman have done with a good computer? My God, in a sense, he anticipates a lot of the parametricisms that happen now. But he or his assistant, or whoever the hell it was, sat there churning this thing out and hoping that you didn't get the line in the wrong place. It remains, so that raises another issue, is does it have more power now because it was a breakthrough? Does it have power because some poor bugger sat and drew it? Whereas somebody now could go bang, 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 could go bzzz, out the other end. Lovely. I'm not sure, because we are too emotional. We remember Conrad Waxman in his white suit and his white ties, and we remember his kind of involvement. You see, there, I think, my anecdote is talking about something where the guy was involved in an idea, and if it had to be drawn, it had to be drawn. If somebody had to mill the steel to make the thing, it had to be milled. And my God, he nearly got some of it built out in the desert, but it never quite happened. It was part of a shared activity. And to me, the creative moment, if there was a moment, the creative condition existed between the drawing and the thing turning and Conrad having this preoccupation. To me, the best drawings have always been those where the preoccupation dominated and the craft came if it was there, didn't have to if it didn't. And so one's intrigued by then conditions where the situation, in a sense, is easier. I've always enjoyed Bernard's clarity. Another anecdote I remember was when Rem Koolhaas came up to me in the A bar and said, "Why didn't we win the competition?" Meaning this La Villette. And I said, "You're too clever by half." Because Bernard is somehow able to hold quite sophisticated ideas in an extremely clear and simple way. I've always felt that about his work. And here, he was canny enough to not attempt to do a complicated architecture. The figures, in the sense you can say on the right-hand side, the diagrams, if that's what we might call them, drawings, say virtually all there is to be said at the building, about the building. When we look at the building on the left, it says a little bit more. Yes, the underside is dark and the handrail is shiny, but pretty much the statement has been made by the right-hand sheet. The left-hand merely is the same thing with a bit of blue sky behind it. Now, I'm exaggerating, of course, but I think there are certain territories of architecture where they are essentially graphicate, that the architectural vocabulary can be brought very, very close to the pre-representation, which also intrigues me because now in my dotage I'm building, I realize that there are so many other issues involved in most of the buildings. To make a simple-looking building is extremely difficult in many cases. I'm an admirer of Ito for many, many reasons. I think he's been one of the most creative architects of more or less my generation anywhere. And every 5 years he comes up with something that you suddenly say, my God, he's moved forward. It's extraordinary. But what's interesting about these three, I think, is the scribble, which I know was done after the event, and a typical commercial Ito building in Ginza, and the way in which this rather simple mannerism, if you like, can be seen in the way that he organizes other buildings. That if you're on, it almost suggests if you're onto a good mannerism, you can use it in plan, section, elevation, perhaps even three-dimensionally. But that Ito is, I think, sufficiently self-assured to be able to not gloss the thing. In a sense, the little diagram does say as much as the other two drawings. But there are other kinds of mannerism. It's an interesting guy who was a student at the Bartlett some years ago, had been before that an extremely ordinary bloke. He's a real sort of English ordinary bloke, working in ordinary bloke type offices. And then suddenly came and did this extraordinary thesis project, which now has been bought by the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And it was also very strange because it showed a creative cynicism, which is not so typical to the English, in setting up hypothetical 3 or 4 families of Austrians, I think in Graz, and their lives and their woes and their disappointments. And it was extremely sophisticated in its narrative. But also these drawings, in their self-conscious, almost their heraldic quality, were, to me, a very curious, intriguing take, somewhere between traditional English 19th century repro heraldic, but talking about the Austrians. Weird, huh? And then what's happened to the guy? He's back there, he's running Make's office in Hong Kong. He's gone back to being an ordinary guy, ordinary bloke architect. Wonderful. I mention this because sometimes is it the hothouse of a certain kind of school? Is it a retreat into drawing? Is it, again, we're into psychiatrist's couch territory. Is this a certain way in which, by almost detaching himself from Austria, being a commentator upon Austria, but actually exposing a very rich and inventive psychology and mind, but he uses this stylization almost to hide behind. One wonders if in history there were periods of drawing when it didn't matter what you did as long as you hid behind the manners, as long as you wore the right kind of shirt, drawing-wise. You could hide your own personality into it. I don't know. I've always been fascinated by the John Puttock phenomenon, and I don't know the answer, but I merely report to you the phenomenon itself. This business of what you hide, of course, is that I use this in. I haven't really looked at the book to do this lecture. I decided to make the lecture independent of the book, but there were 1 or 2 pics in there that I couldn't resist. This one in particular, because it's not an architectural drawing, it was a commercial drawing done in order to sell some kind of show-off period in design. It was the Chicago World's Fair. And so, to the taste of most of us, I suspect, it's a pretty crappy-looking building. It's a pretty bland-looking drawing. It's a poster drawing. But it was selling what we would have been believing in at the time. So it's presenting architecture, not in an architectural way, but in a kind of, come to Blackpool kind of way. Which is also curious. Hiding all the things that we've been talking about today behind a kind of bland, populist condition. All there is craft as craft as craft. I don't know anything about Beresford Pite except I looked up the caption. I guess he was a good bloke at the time, and somewhat masturbatory in his drawing technique, I would say. Sort of guy that says, you know, if there's a patch of space here, let's fill it up. You know, there's another patch there. Oh my God, we've left one out there. Let's fill it up. You know, keep it all with stuff, and stuff. You know, everywhere there's stuff. My God, help! Leave it alone. But it's fascinating for that reason. Not even sure. The building could be on Harvard campus, couldn't it, almost? Sorry, Yale campus, wrong place. There are people who are immensely fascinated by the issue of drawing. This is by my friend Nat Chard, who is at the moment is marooned in the wastes of Manitoba, but should be rescued by a good faculty. He has just completed his PhD thesis, which includes 12 machines for the analysis of drawing. He's been teaching for 25 years, and all his students have made cameras with strange things scratched into them and all sorts of devices to do with the analysis of drawings. And his other interest is in those set pieces that you get in American museums with foxes in the front. But these machines are extraordinary because they're concerned with the trajectory of paint, of the seizing of the moment at which the surface is attacked. And he then makes them into an architecture. It sort of asks about face in a way. Or we have Lebbeus. Now, I think Lebbeus has been, for many years, fighting the fact that he's such an extraordinary technician. His technique in drawing is such that he makes the likely or the unlikely look likely. He can make something that is almost preposterous have patina and surface and structure, and he knows enough about building to make it authentic. And this was at the time when his mother-in-law, I think, was still living in Ljubljana, and the stories are that Lebbeus would go in an armoured car and come out again. I'm not sure whether he was holding a pencil at the time. Or there is the question of people who can really master technique and then break out of it. C.J. Lim, on the London scene, is probably the best architectural, most creative architectural drawer. But at a certain point, we see on the left his sort of standard issue production, which may involve computing, yes. And on the right, at a certain point, about 6 years ago, he broke out and took the drawings and pulled the drawings off the paper so that they were they models? Not really, because they were still drawing. They were created as drawings. But he broke through the boundary between the flat drawing and the three-dimensional object. I'm fascinated by notions of completeness. Can the drawing complete? I'm in this piece of work from the École des Beaux-Arts, fourth year project of the Beaux-Arts, so that you had to reconstruct the Roman temple. My suspicion is that the Roman temple is reconstructed more perfectly, more amusingly, more delicately, more lovingly than it probably ever was when some guys in Rome just built the bloody thing. And I think that, of course, that one could divert off onto another subject, which is the ways in which the tradition of the École des Beaux-Arts has been useful to later generations or not. I provocatively wrote in something in Paris not so long ago that I thought the Beaux-Arts hadn't been quite such a bad thing, because at least it made people concentrate upon organization, which the French architects are very bad at. And I'm also fascinated, and I haven't got an example here, but just in passing, between the essential difference between a Beaux-Arts section drawing and a modernist section drawing. Because in the Beaux-Arts section drawing, the theatre is important, the surface is important, the section is just a white patch that some guy who builds things will come along and build, but it is the facade, the interior facade, the exterior that matters. The modernist drawing, of course, reverses the whole thing. It is the profile that is important, the guts that is important. The rest doesn't matter. And when we return to that, I think some of the most marvelous architectural drawing, of course, when done by a person as brilliant as Enrique Miralles, is just straight, bog-standard positioning of things. Enrique was so inventive, was so extraordinary. I think this is the Utrecht Town Hall extension. Was so inventive that the positioning of all those parts and the fact that one might be 43 centimeters and the other 42 centimeters or whatever was what it was about. It didn't need special drawings because the brain was doing this extraordinary manipulation. And it raises the issue that if, of course, the sophistication or the quality of the manipulation is enough, do we need a fancy drawing? We just need a drawing that gets the thing done. Now, perhaps I'm coloured by my recent experience of suddenly coming around to doing buildings. And I have to admit that I have more interest in this kind of drawing as to what it tells you. It's rather like score reading. It can be read almost like a score, and you can imagine the kind of architecture that Miralles may make in the vertical. And on that theme, I come back to Mike Webb, because Mike Webb had this extraordinary technique. From about third year onwards, he could draw anything like a dream. And I think the power of the furniture manufacturer's building was that it was so precisely drawn, it was so likely to be real, that what scared some people, I suspect, was that you could build it. It wasn't a woolly drawing. We always used to get very irritated with our French contemporaries because they always did stuff that looked like it would never hold up, never had any handrails, and you didn't know how it would be built. Against the North Sea culture, you know, put your raincoat on and hope it lasts and have a good solid stick kind of psychology. I return to my central point, which is identifying the creative moment, and use perhaps somebody wouldn't expect me to use, such as Eric Moss, who talks like a football manager, but is in fact an intellectual, as you know. And he meanders around a project. What is intriguing between the first drawing, this is him, Eric, sort of saying what he's interested in, somebody coming along and then adding information onto a rather bog-standard production drawing. And the question then, and then somebody does another drawing, and you know it's lost. You know that somewhere there was a point at which the thing made its point. And then, in a sense, the later drawing, dare I say it, is gratuitous. And one attempts the same thing with Christine's shadow house. And I was there and watched her doing it. So the pencil drawing is not full of indecision. It sets up certain signals. The ink refined drawing clarifies what she's trying to do. And the colored drawing is nice to have on the museum wall. Question: where was the point at which the project actually existed? In a sense, one's back to one's central point. Where is the moment, or the part at which you start salivating? And when is it lost? Though the lost one is more popular, more acceptable, looks like something. In a recent project we did in our studio, okay, they are computer drawings, but the same issue really is happening. At one point, a certain manipulation of the computer model is dealing with tweaking and composing. At another point, it's dealing with compiling some of the technical categories. At another point, you're manipulating. Somewhere there are certain moments when you say, hey, we're getting near there, and then it's sort of, well, I can say, yes, at a certain moment, you say, yeah, around there, that's it. Now, you had the same mental arm movement as if you had the pen. You say, yeah, that's it. And then, pressures of life. It's a pretty drawing. Diana, it does have a not completely blue sky, but the children are suspiciously happy, and the grass is suspiciously well mowed, and the concrete work is suspiciously even. But there is, of course, this was a competition project, as you might gather, and it is, so I caption it picture, because I sort of know that we've gone past it somewhere, that the picture is necessary, and you say, that's what it looks like. But you know that it's lost, in a sense, dare I say it, it's lost that moment. It's gone into another world. Oh, doesn't it look nice? Yes. And the guts of the issue, of the design issue, are left behind. I've been fascinated by Ferris, of course, like many, and it's more New York than New York really is. And of course, if you look at the right Ferris drawings, you can see that it is a sort of process of kind of whittling down, refining down. But then he stops. For me, he stops at the irritating moment at which he never really suggests what the windows would do. And I come from a culture where the nicotyness of the window is the interesting part, so that this exercise stays detached. Maybe that was very convenient for him. Maybe it made him usable by all and sundry. Maybe he didn't know how to do windows. Should I say that? Daniel was referred to earlier. I have a slightly different take. And of course there was Daniel of Cooper Union, of Haydock importing to him his analysis of Corbusier, the Corbusian parts, at that period when Daniel hadn't quite started to explode things. But my take on these exploded drawings is that after I remember, of course, that Daniel was a classical accordionist. He was a musician, and a good one. And if you look at this drawing and you work across it in one dimension, you can and you start scoring it for 16 staves of a large orchestra, you start to see certain compressions and contrivances and diminuendos and counterpoints that could very well be a musical score. This is my take on this, that actually the drawing is composed and has its intensities and its de-intensities, as would a piece of romantic scoring. I sort of feel it's Hindemith rather than Stravinsky. And so in a sense it's refreshing to come back to Bernard, who can very succinctly, perhaps to some of you oversimplistically, make this analysis between dynamic and structure. And yet, even he is complicating the issue. I've had this slide for a very long time and haven't found a better one so far, but I admire the fact that a ballet choreographer is dealing with time and position and certain levels of interpretation. He's dealing with many dimensions, and yet we make these very complicated drawings. I think we should look more at choreography drawings to make a more dynamic architecture, but I hope that's not a digression. To me, the drawing can say what often we not only can't say, sometimes that we daren't say. I think that in the present architectural climate, many people are very afraid to really say what is in their head. They say what they feel is an okay thing to say. And perhaps drawing is therefore not an escape, but an honesty, even if you're not very good at it. I suggest that just as a sort of aside. Smirk, went to Athens and made his own take upon it. It's not attempting to be a rendition of the Acropolis. It's all that Smirke needed to stimulate himself on the subject, perhaps. Or something ridiculous, like Socrates. This is an older favourite of mine, because it's silly. I come from the seaside, you have to remember. And if you come from the seaside, you understand parasols and plants that are not the right scale, and doors in silly places, and huts on sticks. Or maybe they're lollipops that want to be huts. And I think that such people are immensely refreshing. And the power of the drawing is irresistible. Back to Lebbeus, because Lebbeus uses all his art. He uses all his considerable knowledge of building and anger and anguish and attack. At times his drawings have been very, very worrisome. And then as he started to, and as everybody knows now, he does these amazing blogs, as he started to talk and write, you realize it wasn't just the technician, it wasn't just the craft person, it was actually a thinking architect who happened to have this ability as well. There are other people around who have a sort of very English devil-may-care attitude. Will Alsop, though he doesn't come from the seaside, might just as well. He makes these paintings of objects that hover near to being the architectural piece. And once you know his work, and the people who work with him do, you read the code and you say, yes, what he's suggesting is a building of 43 meters long and 28 meters wide, and it will have 4 Northlight trusses in it, and it will use his favorite kind of steel to prop up the upper gallery, and then it will have an attack from holes, or as Diana was showing this afternoon, one was a building with a sort of whirligig attacking it. That is his spirit, and I know that from his way of working that he doesn't just do these, he doesn't sell the paintings, he doesn't do them for effect, he does them and often just then hides them. But they are necessary in order to get his creative juices going. Now, I can't paint as well as Will, and many years ago I was trying to summarize an attitude, a kind of atmosphere of something and I wasn't on drugs, so I had to draw it. And I was intrigued by this notion of floating and sailing as if you were on some kind of cloud or surfboard or something or something or something. And because I was a graphic plodder, I borrowed stuff out of magazines and drew between them and tried to get a notion of a sublime state of some sort. Much more recently, and this is a 3-year-old drawing, I've been hovering around the idea of the question whether a vegetated condition can have ambiguous elements in it which are tectonic. There are parts of the drawing that are kind of rhetorically naughty architecture, so that there's these sort of dunce's caps or whatever they are in the corner, which are obviously created objects. And if you look at the drawing, you can find other places where there are definitely pieces of organized material, metal probably, glass probably. But others where one's attempt to summarize the drift of vegetation and the drift of land at a point where it does virtually become organized, is to say there is no dividing line between the natural and the vegetated and the man-contrived. And how near can we get moments where there is no dividing line between the one and the other? So that one uses, and this took a long time to do, it's part of a large drawing, use a drawing like this in order to talk to yourself about this ambiguous condition. Or my friend Marcos Cruz, who uses a drawing to discuss another uncomfortable, ambiguous condition between the idea of a skin, a latex kind of skin, and the skin of a building, and the skin of a person. And again, a drawing that moves in and out of that puzzlement. Or Lebbeus again, who can drop New York with a pen. Extraordinary, wonderful thing to do. Or Mark West, who spends most of his time in Manitoba contriving very strange pieces of concrete. He's a professor with an institute that molds strange pieces of concrete and then goes with, as Mike Webb calls him, the king of graphite. He's a former Haydock student, I explain. And he goes with his graphite and starts to weave a sort of city that might be made of that same concrete, but for which even a well-funded institute can't begin to provide. And so it's the day job becomes the night job, as it were. The dust on the drawing board is an extension of the stuff hanging out in the laboratory in sacks of concrete and stirrups and all sorts of stuff. Fascinating. Or Mike Webb, who has his extraordinary ability to pursue an idea and even a set of drawings for 40 years. His obsession with his hometown of Henley where the Royal Mile is rowed, and his obsession with the mathematics of seeing. And then in a recent lecture at the Bartlett about 3 weeks ago, he then showed that he's done some new drawings in the last half year, which, this is not one, which overlay real positions of objects on the drawing as a frozen condition, so that there is a battle, so to speak, between the actual distance of the mile and these relative positions on the surface of the drawing, which means that one of them, of course, would be 100 times bigger than the other if it were then placed into... Now, I'm getting tied up in knots here, but Mike would give a lecture about it. Whether you'd know any more about it at the end of it, I'm not sure, but he would give a wonderful lecture. And he's been preoccupied with issues such as this, with issues of the world hidden behind the object, the obscured part of the drawing becoming more important than the bit that's overt. And he returns, this is a new drawing of his other preoccupation of the vehicle that inhabits the space, that you sit in the vehicle, and by turning the vehicle you become part of this sort of egg-like house. And there are, 30 or 40 versions of this preoccupation and this drawing. And you notice, rather like the Toomey drawings in a certain way, they are actually quite simple drawings. They're actually very graphical. But he hasn't solved it yet. Now, I know that Patrick is talking tomorrow, and perhaps he will show some of the work from their office. I, being an old fart, I suppose, prefer the work that they were doing at this period. I think it's much more interesting, much more original, much more creative. And I'm glad to report that next to our site in Vienna is, of course, Zaha's building, which is a little bit bigger, which is going to be a stunner, and looks much more like this period of work, though Patrick, I'm sure, would deny it. That intrigues me. What I think is interesting in the context of what I'm talking about is way back in the Peak, where the drawing, the painting of the Peak, makes the city of Hong Kong anticipatory to the Peak. It does a wonderful trick, which is by stylizing the city and emphasizing certain diagonals and certain crevices. It suggests that the whole of Hong Kong is of the Peak building, though in fact you have to look hard to find the Peak building at the back there. Now I think that can either be considered an arrogance or a brilliance, turning your building into the archetype of the city that might be, that is commenting on the city that is, but there is a degree of concurrence. To me, as was talked about this afternoon, the issue of what has happened to the plan and the section and the elevation, I cannot get out of my head, though I hear him lecture fairly frequently on his newer work, I cannot get out of my head Neil Denari's elevations. I can't get them out of my head. They have such power. They have this power of hierarchy. I think of an order that would have done him proud in the École des Beaux-Arts of the 19th century, meaning that you can take a condition and you can see the relevance of the parts. You can see the relative relevance of the parts so clearly with immense technique. And of course, Denari had, as Pichler had in a smaller circle, Denari had an enormous influence upon European architectural students during the period approximately, let's say, 1985 to 2000, somewhere around that period. Every second portfolio I would look at from all over the place in Europe would have Denari influence. And I don't know whether he even realizes this. But there is, speaking as a North Sea person again, there is then the question of the gadget. You see, I think that the gadget comes close to the drawing sometimes. I use this terrible word pernickety again, this business of tweaking fiddle, 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 tweak, 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 swing, tweak, tweak, get it. It's there. No, it's not. Haven't caught it yet. Move it. Yes. And then the specialness of the drawing has, and this has been accused of many people at the Bartlett, that there's been that sort of tradition of that intrigue with the device was the fashionable word that we used 10 years ago. I guess there's another word now. It is very similar to the obsessive drawing. It's almost the same thing, except, well, here it is a drawing. And again, Neil is when he wants to be fantastic, fascinating when you see it come from another culture. One of the most interesting younger architects at the moment around, I think, is Izaskun Chinchilla, who's a lady from Madrid who teaches both there and in London. And her take is also a strange piece of mechanical machinery, yet it could in no way be Inglese, no way could be English. But it suggests that there is this subculture of the tweaker, the inventor, the mad inventor condition. And she is also a sufficiently good drawer to find an obsessive way of making it happen. Whereas somebody like Stephen Hull, who's, I think, a marvelous architect, has a wonderful, nonchalant, quite the opposite thing. I deliberately put this in at this moment to say, it isn't all fiddly, fiddly, tweaky, tweaky, tweaky. Sometimes it can just be the light will fall. You know? Well, there's been a lot earlier this afternoon about the quick burst sketch, so I'll move rather quickly here because I'm, in a sense, probably going to say similar things to what was said earlier. It is intriguing to me that we can take a Niemeyer sketch and, if the culture is right for it, the building's pretty much like the sketch. It works in a culture where obsessive detail is not on the agenda. It doesn't work in certain other climates. So therefore, I'm digging around Mendelssohn again, the same as Diana. I'm rather amused by the slightly obscene-looking early versions of the tower. I'm intrigued by the rather boring versions. That it was, you see, what it suggests is that it wasn't a quick flick of the wrist. He was there, scratching away and doing more scratching away, more scratching away. And even the plan, what is intriguing about the plan is its sort of Henri van der Velde quality. I mean, it's quite shocking in a sense. It's suddenly. But there's the quick flick of the wrist sketch, just for those of you that say and want to know that Mendelssohn did these quick sketches and they're only so big and so on and so forth. Actually, I wonder if it was a con. I wonder if he went home late at night and sat there doing lots of them. And then there was the good one, and it went, there you go. I once, another terrible bit of name-dropping anecdote, but I once went to have an interview with Oscar Niemeyer, and I got to the top, and this lady introduced me, and he was standing at a sort of music stand with a charcoal, just doing his drawing. Okay. Wind forward 4 years, my friend Peter Pran from Oslo said, I saw Niemeyer recently. Said, I went up to the top of the flat, and there he was at this stand drawing with a charcoal. I said, gotcha. Maybe that's what he does. You know, they ring down, they say, we've got some bloke from somewhere, you know, coming up. He said, oh, fuck. You know, gets off his daybed, gets on the old. Now, I'm being cruel. He's 109 or whatever, and he's brilliant. I hope I make it to that. But I'm intrigued by, there is also the question of, I'm being somebody who has difficulty drawing, I'm not sure about the quick flick of the wrist. What intrigues me about this building is, of course, in a sense, it gets near to that Cathedral of Niemeyer's. It appears to be a simply detailed building. But hold it, guys, it's Potsdam, and it rains, and it has frost. And what is intriguing is that, of course, that there were... Well, and the secondary thing is, you know, if you're into cut-out windows, the way the windows are cut out is rather clever, even if it's all pumice stone and blockwork and God knows what, and chewing gum behind it, and then it's cemented over. But they're pretty good. Now, whether, and I love to invent biographies. I'm not a good historian, you just have to invent it. But you can imagine life being what it is, that Eric had, you know, Herbert, or whoever it was, at his elbow, and he said, Herbert, sort the old windowsills out. And Herbert was a fanatic, and he would work away late at night, making sure that the thing did it. And that's another sort of drawing, because there is, back to Neil, there is the obsession with the intention and the kind of drawing that will actually get it. Not the flick of the wrist, but the flick of the wrist in northern climates, maybe not in Brazil, in northern climates, needs another guy with a sort of slower wrist, or now, of course, with a computer. He'd have been great with, you know, if Herbert had you know, MicroStation or whatever the hell. I'm intrigued by, therefore, on that basis, the fact that Constant was booted out of the Situationists. Archigram is always being compared with the Situationists, and I suspect that most academics prefer the Situationists because they were political. They had lots of bullshit that they wrote. We wrote different sort of bullshit. We just drew bullshit. But what is interesting about Constant is that you can see from these drawings that he was actually involved in the stuff. He was working away at it and investigating, drawing and investigating, and probably got up the nose of the other guys for whom, you know, they couldn't do that. And they wanted to be political all the time, so they kicked him out. This is my take on the story. But I'm always intrigued. Mike Webb and I went to hear him lecture, and we were so obsessed by the quality of his slides. I don't think we talked about anything else for the next month. Don't think we remembered any of the theory. I think Shen, who I taught together with for half a year, was a most extraordinary product of what I would call the North Sea culture. Here, in this very special location, would be a cleft in the rock. And in the cleft, you carefully place a piece of building. And look, the building is of the same basic ilk as that Sterling and Garn drawing earlier on. Very simple positioning things, a few little deft tweaks. Very simple drawing. But Fen, and I can almost still hear his voice, then we were at the end of the world. You know, I'm sure Johannes could do it better than me. I can hear him say, at the end of the world, and then we make a cut. And he makes the cutting. But then, intriguing thing is, so it's sort of backtracking on these very simple postulates within that cleft. Then, what's interesting about the drawing at the bottom is it's a positive-negative one. It goes back to the simple proposition of how you do it. Doesn't tell you more than the drawing previously. Doesn't tell you less. It's just a slightly different way of doing it. Do we confuse mannerism with the creative act? I have done a mannerist drawing. It in fact sits in the archive of the Royal Academy. It is my diploma work, so to speak. It's based upon my wife's city. My wife comes from Tel Aviv. I'm fascinated by Tel Avivians. The drawing, in a sense, takes, for me, the most simple, easiest throw, which is to do an elevation drawing, which summarizes a series of ideas and a series of personalities. So each, wrong way around. Each piece of the kebab is in fact representing a different entrepreneurial type. And then I place behind it a red sky. Things can get bad in Tel Aviv, but the sky is never actually red. But of course, the sky is not red in Cambridge either. And my teacher, Peter Smithson, years before me, had done a red-skied drawing. And it stayed with me. I recommend the red sky if you want to make a simple statement. Or the deadpan. I think Wes Jones, this drawing is like him, for those of you who know Wes Jones. He has that sort of rough, don't mess with me manner. And here is a rough, don't mess with me piece of Usonian building made of these rather boring panels. And the drawing says everything. It's in a way not a good drawing, but it's a great drawing because it puts its heart into the pieces. Many drawings that I see now have a sort of strange over-consistency about them. In a sense, I was praising the Zaha Peak drawing because it turned Hong Kong into her world. But here, this assumed city standing outside that window doesn't convince. And the rest looks like some kind of endless, wipeable plastic. Maybe it is. I think I rather repeat what Diana said this afternoon, which is that I don't find the matter of what is suggested engaging. I don't find it very agreeable. But maybe it's not trying to be, whereas this is, of course, trying to be extremely agreeable. This is Avakumov, who I think is an interesting sort of architect-artist, staying very much within his own culture, not only accused of being a paper architect, but then doing a piece of architecture on paper, which is in homage to his hero. And then the paper is a newspaper, just so you got the point. We're in Russia, guys, and here it is, and it's red, and it's in Russia, and it's and it's in Russia, and okay, got it? Right? Okay, Yuri, carry on. And I wonder if Piranesi was a bit like that. I have my suspicions. I want to briefly go past Graz only in terms of a couple of aspects of drawing it, or three aspects. One, the after the event flick of the wrist sketch. There was a sketch one evening when we'd spent a month doing one version of the competition, and then said, we're missing it, we're missing it, we're missing it. And Colin and I just talked. As we talked, I did this thing, which was the plan form that we ended up with. After the event, I say, what's a building? Pin and skin. Pin, skin, done. What do? You go in, bit of a surprise, done, carry on. Then, but really one of the most interesting aspects of the drawing, of the project, of course, is its undulating, pixelated condition. Now, the guys that put the pixels in did these necessary working drawings, I suppose, circuit drawings. It could be anything. It clever guys, but the drawing has no power. But again, circuiting around, trying to find the magic moment, I sat down and drew an elevation as I know how. I sat there with an ink pen, drew it, put lots and lots, and I can still remember putting these dots in. It took about a day, and I put lots of dots in and said, that's what we're trying to get on the surface. We had a smart guy, now works for Geary, one of our students, and he got the old Photoshop out and started to manipulate. So, yeah, we're sort of somehow coursing around it. And then you could never draw this. There is no drawing that would get it. And even when you take a still photo, because it's a still of something that moves, it doesn't get it. And even you don't get it because it depends on the light quality, the day, time of day, blah, 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 blah. So there's so many layers that in the end you know that poor old tradition of drawing, it's never going to get near there. But you've got to draw around the idea in order to get the conversation going. There was a reverse thing, which was this wonderful guy that sat in the corner the whole time of the production of the building, doing these amazing logging computer drawings that logged, I think there were 700 of them, some horrendous number, that simply logged all the moves being made in progress of the building. But the other thing was that there was still Chernikov sitting in the back of my brain. And the power of that Chernikov drawing, the notion of this cantilevered thing that stuck out into space, that was sitting in my brain at certain moments in designing the Graz building. I think that intellectuals like the diagram because it sort of depersonalizes, it de-architecturalizes. You don't have to have preference about windowsills, mannerisms, if you diagrammatize enough. Leon's an interesting, complicated guy, so he does interesting, complicated diagrams. Even Eric is an interesting, complicated guy, does less complicated diagrams. And in this particular project where he was putting bandaging around the notion of an office block that never quite happened until it becomes stylized, we know it's already lost it somewhere, and then makes an exhibit which is really a three-dimensionalized drawing, which you know it's gone past the moment at which it's interesting. I find figure ground diagrams tiresome because they only tell you about one condition. I happen to know Wiesbaden, so I know what that diagram is saying. Wiesbaden is much more interesting than that diagram. Yes, there is the formal street layout part, and then there's the hilly part with the villas on it. But that's only just the beginning of what it's really about. And yet the collage, the figure ground diagram dispassionately reduces it to that. And so I find these, you know, perhaps if you have a certain, if you assume that all the architecture is of a moment and you happen to know that architecture very well, it becomes like one of those black and white maps of a town that never really shows you whether a park is even green. I have that attitude to figure ground. I think it's been a tyrannical, tiresome, academic way of looking at the presence of objects and circumstances. And I much prefer Schwitter's, where every part has a nuance and a history and a series of possible interpretations, but you can get into those interpretations. And he calls this one complicated. Albeit that, having said that, I admit to being fascinated always by the Chancellery competition of Aspelin, because it did a brilliant thing in quoting a piece of pre-existent street and then turning that into an architectural proposition. Except then I get irritated because, yes, there probably are clues that it's a neoclassical, but with Aspelin you can never be too sure. And one wants to know more about the building, even on that drawing. So I have a hate, in brackets, love-hate relationship with the diagram and the figure ground. And obviously so did Raymond. So did Raymond Abraham. He he couldn't make this Berlin proposition on a figure ground. He had to give it layers of Tyrolean angst and surface and rasping. I don't know whether he actually screwed the paper up, but he could well have done. Whereas my friend Cedric was able to be dispassionate and made a virtue of only just putting enough in there. This is one of his more architectural. I'm going to speed up now because I know I'm running late. I can see your face, but I mustn't go too fast, otherwise it'll spoil the show. And I think that his habit of having half a bottle of brandy, reading 9 newspapers, and making 6 phone calls before 9 o'clock in the morning was a useful one, in that it enabled him to quite honestly present the strategy of a project in whatever manners it needed to be complementarily. This is a form of diagram that goes, it's too sensitive just to be a diagram. Albeit that when he did the occasional time when he did a really formal drawing, you can look at it and you can see it as part of an English tradition of people like John Piper. If one knows about that kind of thing, he could actually be quite a discriminator. He was actually a rather good drawer. It's interesting to me that Chinchilla has many of the same approaches to Cedric, though done with a kind of Madridian interpretation. You see, drawings can presume that all is not what it seems. This is a typical, I don't know the guy, but a typical Bartlett project, where if we look at that house, there are hidden conditions, there are very mechanical conditions, there are very elegant conditions, there are spooky conditions, and it is a computer-produced drawing. It's a digitally produced drawing, which has carried on the same, in a way, almost the same nuance as the tradition of Peter Wilson and Pichler and Abraham in its own curious way. And Chernikov, too, could hint and be explicit and be diagrammatic all at the same time. Sometimes there are drawers that intrigue you because you look at it. You say, well, that could only really be on a drawing. Great, nice, intriguing guy. But yeah, okay, it exists as a drawing. That's wonderful. And I always get irritated by people saying that therefore is nothing to do with architecture. Except that he sometimes builds it. Gotcha. There are times, there are times when there was a moment, I think, and it persists in certain parts of Scandinavia, where the tradition is to do the drawing in such an ordinary way that it doesn't, it in no way explains the building. I think Schneider-Esleben was one of the better guys around. He did that weird sort of strange church that looked like that, but he also did this bus garage, and if you look at the bus garage, probably better than any of the bus garages you've got in this town, and yet the drawing makes it look absurdly tiresomely boring. So there are, far from the drawing taking the architecture further, it so undersells it, it's not true. But there is, of course, always this question between reality and the invented architecture. After all, O'Gorman knew his Corbusier and built his Frida Kahlo house and a house for her big husband, in some ways, slightly better than some of the Korb houses. But then went sort of crazier and crazier, and goes back into the netherworld of Mexico and starts making this architecture. You can see from my own drawing why I'm fascinated by this kind of stuff. Or by my friend Marion Coletti, who, using a computer, can make a vegetated world more wonderful than I can ever use with paint and ink. Nearly there. Or Hanan, who I think is one of the most evocative architects I know. I think I'm a tremendous admirer of his work, and I think that he uses the machine to be more seductive and curious than many, many drawers of the old drawing. So we asked the question, what would Prinslin have done with Maya, let's say? What would he have done with Rhino? I think, and I say this again, very aware of where I'm speaking, and there are many words people in the architecture world who need the story, they need the symbols, they demand cultural references all the time, whereas the drawing may actually be about trying to find the sublime. Now, I held back from using that dangerous word with all its connotations, but I think that what I've been coursing around is an instinct that some of us have, or many of us have as designers, that there are moments when you do sense the sublime about some aspects of what you're designing, whether it will ever get built or not. And I feel that the great power of a drawing is that it is part of that search. Somewhere, this is a project where we won the competition, but since it's Italy, of course, it never happens, and where the pursuit of the project lies somewhere between those two drawings, somewhere between the, I can only do a hand movement, the coaxing of the thing, using digital processes, and then the interpretation of that coaxing, still also using digital processes, and a lot of drawing as well. I end with a picture of my friend Adolfo Natalini, another old European friend, looking pensive with a pencil. What is he concerned about? Because he's made a drawing and he can only stand back from it. Thank you. Sorry, it went on a bit.
I need
Oh,
it.
you need it.
How beautiful it would be if we could all get up to the party and continue and have a nice evening. What a sinister fate to be in this position. And to be in this position without even being an American academic who could, authentically, contradict when Peter Cook says that academics don't like craft. I'm not even Austrian-Hungarian, only Swiss. And as a Swiss, of course, I find Peter Cook slightly crazy. I mean, I can't help it. I always did. And I continue, But then, of course, that's what I like. So anyway, I shouldn't be longer than Peter, in any case. Okay. So I begin with an observation, then want to formulate a nagging suspicion that became more pressing as I was listening to you this evening, before finally adding yet another small, or not so small, example to the rather long enfilade of drawings we have been confronted with today, which I hope will bring us back to some of the more general issues which this conference wants to raise. And I apologize right away for the archaeological or antiquarian character of the 4 slides that I'm going to show. Here is the observation. Not very original, because it has been made time and again this afternoon. Architectural drawing, as we have seen this afternoon and evening, is not just doing fine, it is thriving, despite, or maybe even because, of the mix of lamentations, death wishes, false alarms, realistic assessments of the dynamics of technology, and inconclusive mythopoetic ruminations that have paved the ways of recent architectural discourse and even of today's conference. And here is my suspicion. Could it be that this thriving success of drawings, the surplus stock of drawings on the marketplace of architecture, this undeniable condition of overflow, at least measured against the number of architectural representations, handmade or not, that are required to get a project built, has ultimately less to do with building or with architecture per se than with the chemistry of visual culture at large, in which architecture is only one among many partners, and with the system's boundless appetite for imagery that surprises, maybe shocks, and in any case entertains, and with the extraordinary capacity of a growing number of perhaps otherwise jobless architects to feed that very appetite. The result being that architectural drawing has steadily emerged ever since the 1960s as an autonomous pursuit, not so much preceding architecture, but running parallel to it, emerging, as it were, as a third power next to or between the traditional protagonists, art on the one hand and architecture on the other. After all, many of the drawings we've seen are now stored in the museum. If we want to really see them, we need to go to the museum. Only if we do go to the museum, we can find out how infinitely more beautiful and interesting they are than we expected them to be on the grounds of reproductions and on the grounds of wonderful slideshows. And here, of course, I may be simply the victim of a typical and definitely very old-fashioned art historian's prejudice in favor of the original as opposed to the reproduction. My own epiphany with respect to certain of those drawings, such as, for instance, this one, and this is my only serious critique with respect to the crazy Peter Cook, that he didn't show enough of his own work, as a matter of fact, and I'm very serious. My own epiphany with respect to drawings like these took place in the museum, because only in the museum, in my particular case, and that wasn't actually this particular drawing, but it was drawings, many drawings by Peter Cook. In my particular case, it happens to be the Centre Pompidou. It was in the Centre Pompidou where I was initiated to the incredible beauty of some of those images, because when I first came across Peter's work in magazines, and then again in magazines in the 1960s and the 1970s and 1980s, all this appeared to me as rather strange, or to be honest, rather irrelevant, as me being, mesmerized by this political bullshit, that we sort of tried to find, attempted to find interesting in the 1960s. I found this rather irrelevant, because I couldn't help seeing much of these things otherwise than as one-to-one representations of things that are thought to be as real, while being just too crazy in my eyes to be real. Furthermore, only the museum, the Imaginary Museum of Art History, allowed me finally to understand these things as being part of a discourse that really does go much beyond London, that goes beyond the visual interests of the 1960s, helped me to understand, for instance, that an axonometric like this one, which is actually a very straightforward axonometric, that does indeed go back to Stirling, whom you, Peter, referred to in one of your comments on the drawing, but that it also goes, of course, beyond Stirling, at least to Doesburg, and ultimately even to Choisy. You would probably agree that at least Doesburg and his neoclassical descendants of the Whitcoverian 1950s owe a certain depth to drawings like these. And of course, I don't want to even mention the slightly, well, here is something Yeah, I wanted to show the plugin CD once again. I don't even want to mention anything about the slightly Pyrenean opus reticulatum that seems to envelope, even to grow over in places, the high-tech machinery of this city. Actually, thank you, Peter, for having shown Piranesi, although very, very briefly in your talk, but I think it's perhaps more important than you may have thought yourself. Now, doubts as to whether the traditional boundaries between the genres of architecture, sculpture, and painting are anything more than an outmoded theoretical construction, artificially kept alive by an equally outmoded yet highly formalized system of education, have been around for quite a while. Here is Rena Banham, 1956, in his review of the notorious This Is Tomorrow show, which he measures up against the notion of the synthesis of the major arts, quote, one of the shining abstractions that gather halo-wise about the heads of its masters. Adding that, again, Rena Banham, the most used threshing floor so far for the synthesis has been Siam. And he continues, the idea of synthesis is something the pioneers of the modern movement inherited from the academies and passed on to the masters. When the theme was young, it was simple. Painting was going to lie down with sculpture, and architecture was going to lie down smartly on top of them. But in passing from hand to hand, the theme has begun to split at the seams, some of the stuffing has come out, bats and bugs have got in, and it is by no means certain, as This Is Tomorrow shows, that architecture is still top dog, or that what sculpture and painters produce is necessarily painting or sculpture. This was 1956. More than half a century later, one can't help wondering that while artists and architects and art critics continue to follow widely separate curricula, even at a place like Yale, that they actually do, and what they are interested in tends more and more to turn around similar issues and even to look the same. This situation, I think, has found in Peter Cook both a prime symptom and, as we have now experienced, an extremely eloquent commentator. Thank God he spares us the first truths encapsulated in theoretical definitions. Instead, he invests a kind of curatorial curiosity in the psychology of the act of drawing and the drive behind it. However, despite the truly cosmopolitan scope of your Wunderkammer, perhaps it is your Englishness that leads us to think that your references too must be primarily English, while in fact they may be, after all, more Slavic or Austrian-Hungarian, as you yourself now have confessed. Luckily, I'm running out of time, so you need not be afraid that I would follow Nikolaus Pevsner in an attempt at pushing you into the pigeonhole of the Englishness of English art, even though at one point in your drawing book you position yourself, and you have done it again in your talk, as a late modernist free-former from the tradition of the North Sea, unquote, which would allow for the most adventurous critical shortcuts from some of the work you like, Coop Himmelblau, Lebeus Woods, Günter Domenik, even Zaha Hadid, not to mention Konrad Wachsmann, to the extravagances of the English perpendicular style. In fact, here we are back with Wachsmann. What would Sir Christopher, would have done with a computer? What would the late English perpendicular Gothics would have done with the computer? This is my poor old, laptop of 2 years ago. Okay. To conclude, I think I'm running on time. It is this drawing, or it is drawings like this, that a slightly bemused Heinrich Klotz must have had in mind when he asked Louis Kahn in a conversation he had arranged sometime between 1972 and 73, possibly here at Yale, if Kahn would tear down Philadelphia if he had the power to do it. Kant's answer was a decisive no. Quote, "No, because I wouldn't even know where to begin. The city itself becomes a part of departure. There is so much left in the city which determines its path and happenings." So, why then, if he had no intention whatsoever to tear down Philadelphia, did he imagine Philadelphia as a sort of neo-Roman fantasy land? Klotz was not alone to be irritated. Edmund Bacon, the director of Philadelphia's City Planning Commission, the 1950s, 60s, considered these plans to be, quote, "just awful." And I continue, quoting Bacon, "Lou, why did you conduct so brutal an assault on the city you are reputed to have loved? Why did you, like the gods of old, wield thunderbolts of destruction on every nook and cranny of downtown Philadelphia? Why did you, by your ideas and proposals, like the bombers of Iraq, try to obliterate every obstacle you could find?" You realize that this is a quote of 1991. And finally, always Bacon, the idea of making the parking of automobiles the dominant symbolic element of Philadelphia's skyline is just terrible. Why can't the Kant clique see that this is so? Unquote. We know the story. Bacon, the director of the City Planning Commission, dismissed Kant's plans for he could not read them otherwise than as a representation of a project, an image of Philadelphia as Kant wanted it to look like. That is, an image of a real, yet as now unexisting city, evoked, anticipated by means of graphics. And the same holds true for Klotz, with his similar embarrassment. He chose not to see the drawing as what it obviously also is, and perhaps most of all, both the result and the means of a speculative exploration of universals of urbanism, such as traffic, the rights of the pedestrian, ecological depoisoning of inner cities, and the challenge of civic monumentality, or in a larger sense, of the economy and the poetry of private and public space in a human habitat of today. That Kant himself decisively saw it in that way is illustrated by the fact that in the last versions of the project, he simply replaced the silos by a freeway viaduct. In fact, he even was able to understand Bacon's downright rejection of his plans. Quote, "Bacon is interested in assembling good things and putting them together," he said, implying that if that is your interest, to simply put things together, then there's no point of even looking at my drawing. And he continued, "I'm premise-minded, interested in getting to what is architecture, what is music, in setting up forces to put these things in motion." Unquote. Edmund Bacon needed the telephone and the typewriter to reject Kant's project, but for the premise-minded Kant, drawing appears to have been indispensable for setting up forces to put these things in motion. Had he lived longer, Kant would have been surprised to see the success story of premise-mindedness in recent decades. Thank you very much.